During World War II, not only Allied soldiers took it upon themselves to fight against Nazism, there were also ordinary people who broke out of their routine to come face to face with the Third Reich and its allies. People who had a normal life before the war, but who decided to stand up during the conflict, thus remaining in history. This was the case of Nieves Fernandez, a Filipino elementary school teacher who became a guerrilla leader to confront the Japanese troops, and who is remembered to this day for silently killing more than 200 enemies. In this new episode of Military History, we are going to learn about the life and work of the teacher who became a guerrilla leader, and how she saved hundreds of people during World War II. The exact date is not known, but Nieves Fernandez was born in 1906, in Leyte, one of the many Philippine islands. Before the war, Nieves had a wholesale market and was dedicated to primary education, but all that was put on hold when Japan invaded her country in December 1941, starting what is known as the Philippine Campaign. During that occupation, Japanese troops committed atrocities against the local people, and it is believed that around 500,000 Filipinos died as a result of their abuses. Many women were kidnapped and forced to be prostitutes for Japanese soldiers in military brothels, just as the Germans in Europe did with Polish women. In the case of men, many were taken to do forced labor or were directly executed in the street to destroy the morale of the locals. The Imperial Japanese Army had brutal methods for interrogating suspected Filipinos, the torture often taking place for days and culminating in the public exposure of the victim. One of the most painful torments was when prisoners were forced to drink enormous amounts of water and then tied up and turned stomach up. The Japanese soldiers took turns jumping on top of the prisoners, causing permanent stomach damage. In addition, they carried out experiments on the prisoners, a macabre vice that seems to have been borrowed from their German partners. Surgeries without anesthesia that ended in the death of the patient were commonplace in the prisons set up by the occupying force. The brutality with which the Japanese treated the invaded territories aroused a strong feeling of rebellion, and it was not long before the first Philippine resistance guerrillas emerged in 1942. It is estimated that about 250,000 citizens participated in operations against the Japanese army during the occupation, and among that 250,000 was the protagonist of this video. In general, many rebel Filipinos collected information on Japanese operations and then provided that data to Allied soldiers, since they did not have the equipment, coordination, or means to organize a solid guerrilla. But after a few months some supplies and weapons arrived, and the citizens now had the possibility to organize and respond to the humiliation suffered. From within that spirit emerged the figure of Nieves Fernandez, who was seriously concerned about the well-being of her students. Fernandez feared that the Japanese forces would get bored with mistreating adults and target their torture methods on the students at her school. As for the students, Nieves' greatest fear was that they would be taken as prisoners for clandestine brothels regulated by the Japanese army. With all this in mind, she gathered a group of men and began to plan how to carry out effective attacks on the Japanese troops. They quickly came to the conclusion that stealthy attacks at night worked the best, so Nieves began training these men in the use of knives to kill the enemy before they could make noises and alarm the rest. But not everything was white weapons. They also made clandestine firearms, using pipes to make homemade shotguns of great destructive power. These devices were loaded with gunpowder and rusty nails to generate infection in the targets. Over time they also managed to steal some weapons from the Japanese army, significantly increasing the lethality of their attacks. With this, Nieves Fernandez became the first and only woman to command a guerrilla in the Philippines. Nieves' weapon of choice was the bolo knife, a large cutting tool similar to a machete or kukri, used primarily in the Philippines and Indonesian jungles. This knife was easily accessible as it is used to cut through the jungle, although Nieves gave it other purposes, and she developed a silent method to assassinate Japanese soldiers. At first, she dressed completely in black to blend in with the darkness of the night, and she walked barefoot so as not to make any noise that aroused suspicion. When she found a lone soldier, she would come up from behind him and stab him below her earlobe, severing the carotid and jugular arteries. Once the knife penetrated 2 inches, Nieves rotated the blade 90 degrees, causing a huge wound that prevented the victim from screaming. That lethal cut caused great bleeding. The soldier lost consciousness almost immediately, without the possibility of fighting or calling for help. For many soldiers, the cold from the BOLO knife to the neck turned out to be the last thing they felt. The Japanese troops were very afraid of the guerrilla teacher Nieves Fernandez. Her night attacks became legendary, and together with her men they organized numerous ambushes in the jungle, under the protection of nature and darkness. Nieves was in charge of about 100 men, who carried out attacks in the Tacloban region. Over the course of 2 years, they killed over 200 Japanese soldiers. The Japanese officers were confused about the nature of these attacks and who was leading these guerrillas. When they found out about Nieves Fernandez, they put a price on her head, 10,000 Philippine pesos, for any information on her whereabouts. Many tried to capture Nieves, but she managed to avoid the risks and survived the harsh Japanese occupation of the Philippines. It is said that she, along with her guerrilla, managed to save many young women who were being held captive as sexual slaves by Japanese troops. In some smaller towns, the guerrillas managed to expel all the soldiers of the invading forces, liberating entire communities from the Japanese yoke. When the Allied forces reached Leyte, they found that many villages had already been liberated and some military brothels had been destroyed. It was then that Nieves Fernandez and her activities became known. It is said that she even taught her assassination method to the soldiers, although much information about her is unknown. The only article published at the time describes her as a former teacher who, dressed in black and armed with knives and homemade shotguns, led 100 Filipino men to kill 200 invading soldiers. The article also claims that Fernandez was wounded once, and that she keeps a gunshot wound to her right forearm as a reminder of the harshness of war. When reviewing World War II, the emphasis is usually on horror stories, but that dark moment also led many ordinary people to break out of their routine to become true war heroes. The case of Nieves Fernandez is one of the most paradigmatic, from elementary school teacher to becoming the most remembered female guerrilla in her country. This is how we come to the end of this video. We hope you liked discovering this story as much as we did. If you want more content like this, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications. Until the next episode of Military History.